Chapter 2. Ancient and Modern Wisdom Regarding the Good Life. There is not anything in this world, perhaps, that is more talked of and less understood than the business of a happy life. It is every man's wish and design, and yet not one of 1,000 that knows wherein that happiness consists. Seneca. But it is a misfortune that the concept of happiness is such an indeterminate concept that although every human being wishes to attain this, he can still never say determinately and consistently with himself what he really wishes and wills. Immanuel Kant. For thousands of years, philosophers and theologians have offered prescriptions for what makes a good life and how to pursue the good life. The emphases can differ, of course. If you are an Orthodox Jew, for example, there are 613 mitzvot, religious rules, and 10 commandments. These do not guarantee you earthly happiness, but they will make God very happy. Christianity warns against the 7 deadly sins: pride, lust, gluttony, envy, greed, wrath, and sloth that are antithetical to a good life and separate one from God. But few, if any, philosophical traditions are as concerned with the good life as that produced by the ancient Greeks. After completing my MBA in 1990, I set off on a backpacking tour of 6 European countries: France, Switzerland, Germany, Austria, Italy, and Greece. While in Greece, my travel buddy and I visited 5 Greek islands: Corfu, Santorini, Naxos, Crete, and Falgandros. While sitting at a sleepy cafe on one of the islands, I can't remember which one, I struck up a conversation with a Greek individual who had lived in the United States. I teased him, saying, "How come we never hear of Greece in the news?" He paused for a moment and said, "When you are responsible for Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, you don't need to do anything else. We've contributed more than enough to the enrichment of the world." He was right, but the Greeks did a lot more than offer us the 3 giants of philosophy. They created the philosophical, artistic, cultural, and political grounding of the Western world. My friend and fellow Lebanese best-selling author Nassim Taleb has stated that the field of psychology is useless because all one needs to do to understand human nature is to study the ancient Greeks. He is perhaps playfully, bombastically overstating the case, but he is certainly correct that when it comes to philosophical treatises on the pursuit of a happy and enriched life, few traditions are as rich as that of the ancient Greeks, though they do of course have many competitors. Tim Lomas, a psychologist who specializes in the study of well-being, has, along with 3 of his co-authors, compiled a history of the philosophy of happiness from the ancient Egyptians to the Enlightenment. He has also examined how happiness has been depicted in art over the past 10 years in the West. Another history of happiness comes from Darren McMahon. McMahon explains that the ancient Greeks started as fatalists, believing that a person's happiness was determined by the gods. But subsequent Greek philosophers, like Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, recognized that happiness could be achieved by human action. While many of these later philosophical schools contested with one another, they agreed that happiness was a result of human agency. This was a major advance in the study of happiness. In the Christian tradition, following the lead of St. Augustine, happiness is to be found in an ever closer relationship with God, in prayer, in service to others, and in living the virtues taught by Jesus. Within the non-Western traditions, the ancient Chinese philosophies of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism have their own varied guidelines for living the good life, from the importance of filial piety, to living in accord with nature, to transcending material problems through meditation. More recently, happiness has become a subject not just for philosophers and theologians, but for scientists armed with empirical studies. Over the past 25 years or so, many influential psychologists have turned their attention to an examination of happiness. This includes the father of positive psychology, Martin Seligman, along with other leading academic psychologists, including Laurie Santos, who created the Science of Well-Being course at Yale University and the Happiness Lab podcast. David Lykken, author of Happiness, The Nature and Nurture of Joy and Contentment. Sonia Lubomirsky, author of The How of Happiness. Daniel Gilbert, author of Stumbling on Happiness. And Jonathan Haidt, author of The Happiness Hypothesis, among others. Much of the empirical research focuses on the various factors that are linked to happiness. But there is also the question of what happiness produces. Perhaps the most concrete reason to be happy is that it affects our health. Happiness is an elixir of health. Often, when we study human behavior, we see that something can be both the antecedent to an outcome as well as the result of an outcome. And it is important to distinguish between the two. For example, we know that men with higher levels of circulating testosterone, an antecedent variable, are more likely to be aggressive. But we also know that men's testosterone levels increase when they drive a Porsche, an outcome effect. When we study the relationship between happiness and health, we can see both antecedent variables and outcome effects. It is not surprising to find that poor health, as an antecedent variable, can have a negative effect on one's happiness. But it is interesting to note that being happy can lead to better health outcomes. How does happiness improve health? First, it has been shown that happy people are more likely to exercise, eat a healthy diet, and engage in other health-promoting behaviors. Second, people who are happier exhibit a broad range of good health markers, from lower cortisol levels and less inflammation to lower blood pressure. Mental health is another benefit of happiness. Happy people are less likely to say, "I need to make the best possible decision," fretting over getting a maximum benefit, and more likely to say, "I'll look for a winning alternative that is good enough," being satisfied with an acceptable outcome. Happy people are also less likely to fall prey to the influence of social comparisons. Their well-being is less contingent on the successes and failures of others. In their own lives, happy people tend to find the silver lining in whatever happens. This is a trait or a mindset that can be nurtured or trained. As in cognitive behavior therapy, it can stand independent of genetics. Do some personality types promote happiness? Certain things, of course, are genetically fixed. People are born with 2 eyes, 2 kidneys, 1 heart, 10 fingers, and 10 toes. These traits are now fixed within the human genome, defining human anatomy. While humans are identical to one another when it comes to fixed traits, the key variable on which we most clearly differ is our personality. Psychologists refer to personality traits as individual differences precisely because humans are extraordinarily heterogeneous in how they score on a very broad spectrum of such traits. How many personality traits are there? There have been many worthy attempts to create an exhaustive taxonomy of them. In 1936, Gordon W. Allport and Henry S. Odbert utilized a lexical analysis of the Webster's New International Dictionary, 1925 edition, to generate 17,953 personality-related traits out of roughly 400 words. Of course, many of these words might be collapsed under a singular heading because they are essentially synonymous with one another. This has led several other psychologists to utilize various statistical techniques, such as factor analysis, to reduce the larger set of variables down to a much more manageable number, including Raymond Cattell's 16 personality factors model, consisting of 16 traits, and the now widely known Big Five test, or OCEAN, which measures openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Why has evolution retained a heterogeneity of personality traits? In other words, why do we not all have some fixed optimal personality profile in the same way that we have evolved other fixed traits that do not vary across people? Evolutionary psychologists have offered compelling adaptive reasons to explain personality differences, human universals, cross-cultural differences due to biological reasons, and cross-cultural differences stemming from non-biological reasons. It is clear that evolution has not selected a singular optimal personality profile, because no such profile exists across all possible varied landscapes. Personality A might be optimal for environment Y, whereas personality B might be best suited for environment X in evolutionary terms. There are no universal selection pressures to eradicate individual personality differences among people across the globe. That is not to say, however, that certain personality traits don't make us happier than others. A recent meta-analysis exploring the correlations between the Big Five character traits and well-being, and the traits of honesty, humility, emotionality, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness, known as the hexacotypology, and well-being, provided a resounding yes to the question of whether our personalities affect our subjective sense of happiness and psychological well-being. Neuroticism and emotionality were negatively correlated with well-being, whereas the other traits were positively correlated with well-being. A person who is extroverted, agreeable, conscientious, open, and honest, humble, and who scores low on neuroticism and emotionality, has the ideal personality architecture to be happy. That our personality affects our well-being and happiness has been confirmed in an earlier meta-analysis examining 137 personality traits. Another way to divide the data is to separate out different aspects of life and see how much these weigh on one's sense of well-being. For example, a study in Mexico identified 7 key domains of life: health, economic, job, family, personal, friendship, and community environment, and found that the first 5 were the most highly correlated to life satisfaction. But it is also true that people with essentially the same life circumstances, the same levels of good health, prosperity, Occupation, family concord, and personal achievement can have very different levels of happiness. The data show that those who have a good enough mindset, who think scoring 70 out of 100 in satisfaction in these domains is fine, are happier than those with a maximizing mindset, who think they need to score 90 out of 100 in these domains. Happiness is, in part, a product of our own decision-making and what we demand of life. It is part of a mindset. It might come to us naturally, or we can train ourselves to think in a more optimistic, happier fashion, and enjoy the resultant health benefits just as we might train ourselves to diet and exercise. It's a choice. Does wealth lead to happiness? I recently watched the first season of the documentary television series, Narco Wars, about narco traffickers in Colombia and Mexico. The cartel leaders profiled in the show had amassed immense personal wealth and wielded extraordinary power. But I was struck at how similar their circumstances were before they were ultimately captured or killed. Whether we are referring to Pablo Escobar, Medellin Cartel, the brothers Gilberto José Rodríguez Orejuela, and Miguel Angel Rodríguez Orejuela, Cali Cartel, or more recently, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, Sinaloa Cartel, they are always apprehended in some nondescript apartment, cowering or hiding in some dark space, often a secret compartment or tunnel. The same was true when American soldiers captured the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, who was hiding in an earthen hole. All of the wealth and power in the world was insufficient to protect these villains from their ignoble common destiny. From an evolutionary perspective, it is easy to understand why these men would be driven to amass power and money. We can even explain their psychopathic brutality, but it seems unlikely that their power and money, and their immoral willingness to use any means necessary to acquire it, brought them happiness or contentment, or even a sense of purpose or meaning, once justice caught up with them. In the end, all they had was fear and humiliation. These might be extreme examples, but they raise the perennial question, does wealth make people happier? For nearly 50 years, economists who study the economics of personal happiness have been accumulating data on this question and debating what they have found. In 1974, economist Richard Easterlin showed that greater income was associated with greater happiness for individuals, but not so at the aggregate national level. Therein lies the so-called Easterlin paradox, where wealthier individuals are generally happier, but wealthier nations are not. At least, not necessarily, as several more recent studies have indicated that richer countries do produce happier individuals. The question then becomes, is there an inflection point after which more money does not lead to greater happiness? The relationship between money and happiness is not a straightforward one. If you are so poor that you are unable to meet your most basic needs, you are unlikely to be happy, but beyond a certain income level. Can wealth actually decrease happiness? Was the late rapper, the Notorious B.I.G., correct with his Mo Money Mo Problems song? Several studies have found that beyond a plateau of 75,000 per year, an individual's sense of well-being does not increase. This apparently well-grounded data has, however, itself been challenged by a more recent study arguing that higher levels of wealth correlate to greater well-being across the full range of income levels. Take all the big picture data, and you could say, it all depends. But we can also consider the anecdotal evidence, or rather a smaller set of data involving lotteries. My father, for instance, is an avid purchaser of lottery tickets. One of his favorite games is Lotto 649. Choose 6 numbers out of 49. You hit the jackpot when you get all 6 numbers right. One day, when I was talking with students in my office, my dad called me and asked me to recommend 6 numbers for him to pick. I said, "Dad, I'm busy." But he insisted, "Come on, just give me 6 numbers quickly." I replied, "Okay, fine." 1, to which he said, "Well, if you are not going to answer me seriously, there is no point asking you." This combination of seemingly ordered numbers has the exact same probability of being generated as any other combination, even though people wrongly presume otherwise. I share this story because lottery winners offer one of the more interesting areas of research on the links between money and happiness. Early research found that lottery winners were not happier than a control group of individuals. More recent work has documented an increase in life satisfaction, but not in a corresponding increase in happiness. A windfall will undoubtedly reduce one's worries about financial security, but it will not necessarily improve one's long-term existential happiness. Because choosing 6 lucky numbers and reaping the windfall does not by itself give one a resilient, optimistic mindset, or improve one's decision-making, or provide a sense of purpose, meaning, or accomplishment in life. When you achieve great things, be it launching a successful business, graduating from medical school, or raising a happy family, you experience a lasting sense of pride. Not so with having a winning lottery ticket. Several members of my nuclear family have been quite wealthy at various times. One of my relatives owned several Ferraris, each of which he would dismantle upon receipt to customize it to his liking. He also owned an Aston Martin Laguna and an outrageously detailed Jeep with gigantic wheels. This was part and parcel of his extraordinarily lavish lifestyle. His entire identity was rooted in pecuniary pursuits. I warned him long ago that life should not be solely measured by an accumulation of conspicuous luxury items, but he ignored my pleas for temperance and perspective. Fast forward 2 decades, he has lost his fortune and now lives a quiet, modest life. More modest than he would like. Still, it is hard to feel sorry for him because he was financially irresponsible. He thought the money train would always be around, ready to take him to the next station of conspicuous debauchery. But eventually, the money train derailed. This lavish spending explains how athletes, actors, and other obscenely wealthy people can accumulate unimaginable wealth, and yet eventually file for bankruptcy. I was never impressed by the wealth of some of my family members. If anything, I was viewed as the black sheep because I seemed far less interested in material things than in ideas. Even as a young kid, I would rather discuss philosophy than the next model of Jaguar or Porsche someone was planning on leasing. Material possessions can be here today and gone tomorrow, and if your happiness is tied up in them, it, too, can be here today and gone tomorrow. But happiness, as a product of a mindset that combines curiosity, the joy of perpetual intellectual discovery, and an appreciation of life's experiences, can be more lasting. A Nobel Prize. In my academic career, I have had the honor of meeting and interacting with several Nobel Prize winners, or eventual winners. My first such experience was as a first-year doctoral student at Cornell University when I took Richard Thaler's Behavioral Decision Theory course. Thaler went on to win the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2017. In 1992, as a young doctoral student, if memory serves me right, I met Professor Daniel Kahneman and or perhaps his longtime collaborator Amos Tversky, one of the great thinkers on the topic of decision-making. In 2002, as a visiting professor at the University of California at Irvine, I predicted to my MBA class that Kahneman would win the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. Less than 24 hours later, I learned that he had. I also had brief communications with the other 2002 Nobel laureate in economics, Vernon L. Smith, as well as with Paul Greengard, a 2000 Nobel Prize winner in physiology/medicine, and with Kip Thorne, winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2017. While each of these encounters was memorable, none was quite as awe-inspiring as when Herb Simon, winner of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 1978, visited Cornell University in 1993. My doctoral supervisor knew him well, and hence had met him for lunch. I was miffed at the time that I had not been invited to join them, but my disappointment was attenuated when my supervisor sent me a memo, which I still have somewhere, telling me how Simon had praised some of my work. I share these brushes with Nobel Prize winners to contrast how I define wealth, the richness of one's life experiences, with how my more materialistically inclined family members define wealth. During a trip to Rio de Janeiro, I had shared my excitement at meeting the great Herb Simon, one of the truly great polymaths of the 20th century. Rather than sharing in my excitement, my relative smugly stated, "Who the hell is this guy? I can probably buy him 500 times over." To which I retorted, "Perhaps, but while 500 people will wait in line to hear him speak, no one cares what you have to say." So there you have it. 2 ways to accumulate wealth. Through amassing brilliant moments or amassing piles of dollars. Both have their points, but the former can enrich your soul. The latter, if it is all you value, can rot it. Cultural determinants of happiness is the pursuit of wealth as a proxy for happiness found in all cultures. What is the relationship between culture and happiness? In science, we have what we call the weird bias, which refers to an over-reliance on research conducted in Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies, and the presumption that those findings are then globally generalizable. In research into happiness, it is clear that while some factors are universally valid, others are dependent on culture. Happiness itself is a universal desire. In a survey of 42 countries, only 1% of respondents said they never thought of happiness as an ultimate life objective, while 69% said that happiness was highly important to them. It is also universally true that married people are happier than single people, and that extroverts are happier than introverts. Culture, however, is a major factor in determining the extent to which happiness is shaped by eudaimonia, the pursuit of meaning, versus hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure. Individualist cultures place greater importance on hedonistic pursuits than do their collectivist counterparts. The World Happiness Report provides a yearly ranking of countries on the basis of reported happiness. The Scandinavian countries consistently lead the world when it comes to national happiness. The top 10 countries in the 2012 inaugural rankings were Denmark, Finland, Norway, the Netherlands, Canada, Switzerland, Sweden, New Zealand, Australia, and Ireland. The 2021 rankings were strikingly similar. Finland, Denmark, Switzerland, Iceland, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Luxembourg, New Zealand, and Austria. The United States came in at number 11 in 2012 and number 19 in 2021. Surprisingly, freer societies have happier people than do more repressive societies. One explanation for Nordic happiness was summarized thus: the Nordic countries are characterized by a virtuous cycle in which various key institutional and cultural indicators of a good society feed into each other, including well-functioning democracy, generous and effective social welfare benefits, low levels of crime and corruption, and satisfied citizens who feel free and trust each other and governmental institutions. The study also notes that early analyzes quantifying welfare as an aggregate measure of government welfare spending, like the percentage of GDP devoted to public welfare programs, tended to find no link between welfare expenditure and happiness, or even a negatively correlated link. Government spending, as such, thus seems not to be clearly linked to greater or worse life satisfaction. It seems, then, that when it comes to a welfare state, what matters to Scandinavian citizens is, for the most part, a generalized sense of economic security, and the sense that the welfare state supports well-functioning public institutions, including education and public transport. But high government spending and the taxes that support them do not themselves produce happiness, and in fact can produce the exact opposite. I can say definitively, as a highly productive resident of a deeply socialist society in Quebec, Canada, that I have no such sense of economic security or of well-functioning institutions when the state's deeply confiscatory tax system allows me to retain only roughly 1/3 of my income once all taxes are accounted for. Indeed, this makes me extremely depressed and unhappy and resentful that the government appears to think that it owns me, or at least most of my earnings. Personally, I believe that the only path to true happiness is one of minimal government intrusion into our lives and our bank accounts. In Canada, the income tax was originally levied in 1917 as a temporary measure, but as the economist and Nobel laureate Milton Friedman memorably opined, nothing is so permanent as a temporary government program. I find such taxation more soul-destroying than life-affirming. It certainly does not make me happy, and that leads me to another point. Happiness is a positional emotion. Some view happiness as a non-comparative metric. That is, my happiness and my standards for feeling happy have nothing to do with you or yours. But while this might be true for some contributing factors to happiness, the evidence seems pretty clear that happiness is also, in part, shaped by a comparative calculus. We are a social species that cares deeply about our relative standing when compared to relevant others. This is the whole premise behind social comparison theory, and what lies behind the adage, keeping up with the Joneses. It is also at the root of the concepts of positional goods and the positional economy, as explained by Cornell economist Robert Frank in 2 of his books. Take, for example, winner-take-all markets, wherein countless individuals compete for one large reward that will ultimately go to one individual, or at best, a few people, as in auditions for the leading roles in a blockbuster movie. Inherent to such markets is the relative performance of the competitors to one another, rather than some absolute metric of success. The end result, though, is that one person, or a few people, will achieve maximal happiness, whilst the others will be dejected by yet another rejection. From a collectivist perspective, this is a suboptimal allocation of happiness. Ecstasy for one or the few, and misery for many. Particularly in the era of social media, social comparisons can lead to nefarious downstream effects. Everyone posts his best self on social media, so there is a tendency to overestimate how happy, successful, and content he is. And there is a danger for some in concluding, everyone on Facebook is traveling to exotic places, getting married, having wonderful promotions, and my life sucks. For young people, this isn't a special problem. And the power of social comparison within cliques is oftentimes the central theme in films capturing teenage angst. because it is such a common occurrence. The 2015 film, The Duff, Designated Ugly Fat Friend, addresses this issue in a comical manner. Within any group of popular kids, there is always a lesser member which serves to augment the attractiveness of the other group members via the contrast effect. The extent to which people care about relative versus absolute metrics is captured well when it comes to one's salary. Suppose I were to ask you to choose between two options. 1. You receive a 600 salary increase and your colleague receives 800. Or 2. You receive a 500 salary increase, as does your colleague. Note that if you choose option 1, you are left with more money in your pocket than if you were to choose option 2. From a strict income maximization perspective, the so-called rational choice, option 1 should always be preferred. But, of course, humans are a social species, endowed with a calculus for fairness and equitable distribution, so many people will end up preferring option 2. This is surprising to no one other than economists who preach the glory of Homo economicus, a mythical creature of hyper-rationality that exists solely in their stunted imaginations. What applies to money applies also to the most basic of all Darwinian pursuits, sex. At first glance, it might be reasonable to assume that, all other things being equal, the more sex we have, the happier we'll be. But, while our happiness is positively determined by the frequency of sex that we have, it is also negatively correlated to the frequency of sex that those around us are engaging in. Hence, for people to be maximally happy, they should marry a spouse with a high libidinal drive, and surround themselves with friends who are Catholic priests and nuns. A guaranteed pathway to happiness. Happiness is not only a positional emotion, it is a social contagion. That is, it spreads through networks of friends. A network analysis on data from the Framingham Heart Study found that happiness spreads to up to 3 degrees of separation in a network. In other words, beware of how unhappy or happy your friends are. Their misery or elation might infect you. Happiness is a comparative emotion in at least one additional way. In a study of Olympic medalists, bronze medalists were found to be happier than silver medalists. At first, this might seem counterintuitive, in that finishing second should trigger greater satisfaction and happiness than finishing third. If happiness in this case, however, is shaped by counterfactual thinking, comparing one situation against what might have been, the silver medalist will likely compare herself against the gold medalist, while the bronze medalist will likely compare herself to those who received no medal at all. Viewed from this perspective, the silver medalist becomes disappointed, whereas the bronze medalist is ecstatic. Our happiness is, in part, shaped by such comparative analyses. This is precisely why firms are so careful to manage their customers' expectations, because they know a consumer satisfaction level is determined in part, not by some pre-established absolute level of service, but by their expectations. So if Amazon tells you this book is sold out, but Amazon has reordered it and it will be on your doorstep in 4 weeks, and then Amazon delivers it in 1 week, what do you think of Amazon? The Peak-End Rule, the way we assess our happiness as a measure of pleasurable or painful experiences, is hardly objective. Suppose that you went away on a 1-week vacation, and at the end of each day, you ranked how great that day was. Now, let's envision 3 scenarios. In scenario 1, your first 6 days were horrible, marked by rainy weather and the flu. On the 7th day, however, the weather cleared and you felt great. You gave the first 6 days 10 points each, and the last day 100. On a scale from 0 to 100, capturing worst day ever to best day ever. In scenario 2, every day was wonderful with a consistent daily score of 80 points. In scenario 3, your first 3 days were very bad, each with a score of 20. The 4th day was fantastic, score of 90. And the last 3 days were very bad, each with a score of 20. If you were to add up the total happiness of each of the 3 scenarios, they would be 160, 560, and 210. Clearly, from an aggregate perspective, scenario 2 is the one that should be remembered as the best. But Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman has shown, with his peak-end model, that most people will judge an overall experience by its peak, meaning that many people will remember the first or third scenario as the better vacation because they reached higher peaks, and especially the first scenario because the peak is an evolutionary behavioral scientist. I'm always interested in examining the Darwinian reasons that explain the architecture of the human mind. So the obvious question is, why do people assess their happiness in the ways predicted by the Peak-End Rule? Kahneman nailed it when he stated, memory wasn't designed, to measure ongoing happiness or to measure total suffering. For survival, you really don't need to put a lot of weight on duration. On the duration of experiences, it's how bad they are and whether they end well. That is really the information that you need for an organism. And so, there are very good evolutionary reasons for the peak and end rule and for the neglect of duration. It leads to, in some cases, to absurd results. But those are the results, nevertheless. The mismatch hypothesis as an impediment to happiness. Much modern unhappiness stems from evolutionary adaptations that were beneficial in the past, but that are a mismatch with our modern-day environments. Our gustatory preferences, as coded by our taste buds, are a telling manifestation of this point. These evolved to solve a recurring and endemic evolutionary problem. Namely, our ancestors faced environments that were defined by caloric uncertainty and scarcity. From this perspective, it is natural for us to prefer high-caloric foods, such as a fatty steak, or a rich chocolate mousse or potato chips to raw carrots or celery. But now, in societies where caloric scarcity is largely a thing of the past, and where we live more sedentary lives, this evolutionary adaptation that has us favor high-caloric foods is no longer aligned with the current reality. In the science of evolutionary medicine, this is known as the mismatch hypothesis, and it captures the global epidemiology of the lifestyle diseases that plague us in the modern world. In short, to understand some of our current health ailments, physical and mental, we need to appreciate the incongruity between how our brains and bodies have evolved and modern environments. The pursuit of happiness can be analyzed with a similar evolutionary lens, looking at modern environments, how they can form or depart from traits we have acquired through evolution, and how we respond to them. For example, why is it that so many people who live in major metropolitan areas feel lonely? They are surrounded by literally millions of people, yet they feel all alone. This is because there is a mismatch between contemporary urban living and the evolutionary environments in which our ancestors evolved, typically consisting of small bands of up to 150 people, known as Dunbar's number. Such environments allow for the formation of deep emotive and affiliative bonds that cater to our evolved need for meaningful social interaction. You might cross paths with 1,000 or more people on your way to or from work, and yet feel alone in an endless sea of strangers. Innumerable people alone together. As parents, we raise our children with the stranger danger maxim. Of course, it makes perfect evolutionary sense to be wary of strangers on occasion, but strangers also present many new opportunities for future friendships. After all, a stranger today might become your best friend eventually, and it is clear that deep, meaningful friendships constitute a central feature of a happy life, an insight that Aristotle made long ago. Several papers and one recent book have documented how connecting with strangers can contribute to our happiness and well-being, be it when sitting on a plane, taking the subway, or interacting with the barista. We can take the impersonal nature of the big city and turn it into an environment that mimics the past, the reality in which we evolved, creating de facto tribes or small communities within giant cities. In writing this book, I often went to a local cafe. There is a table at the back of the establishment that has become my table. On one visit to the cafe, my son accompanied me, and scouting ahead informed me that my table was occupied. What? Given my routinized behavior, it took me a moment to recover from the indignity of having to find a new table. The gentleman occupying my table, who had noticed my surprised reaction, approached me and asked if I wanted to have my table back. We introduced ourselves, and then I realized that he was the new owner of the cafe. He asked me if he could offer my son and me something on the house. I got an espresso and my son a pistachio cookie, and I invited him to join us at my table. We started to chat, at which point I found out that he was half Pakistani and half Persian, and I shared with him a bit about my background, Lebanese Jewish. He was excited to find out that I was the author of The Parasitic Mind, because the previous owner of the cafe had purchased a copy of my book and placed cafe's bookshelf. His dad's wife, whose parents are divorced, had previously remarked to him that she had purchased a copy of my book. He then found out that I had been a frequent guest on Joe Rogan's show, and that I hosted my own popular show, The Sad Truth. In those few minutes, we bonded by an act of hospitality and friendship. As he got up to leave my table, he said, "You're so low-key." This meeting took place the day prior to my traveling to Florida to deliver a lecture at an event organized by Hillsdale College, as well as my appearing on Tucker Carlson's podcast. I had a million things to do prior to traveling the next day, and yet I was more than happy to seize the moment and connect with someone who appeared to be a lovely, warm, and generous individual. I did not allow my situational stress and time pressure to derail me from this otherwise lovely encounter. This is a parable of how to live an enriching life. Be open to the endless opportunities that life throws at you. When serendipity comes knocking, answer the call. Also, be generous not only with your time, but in your hospitality. When guests come to our home, I expect them to put on weight given the tsunami of food that they are about to consume. Short of that, I have failed as a host. An openness of one's spirit opens you to countless enriching moments, the totality of which makes a quilt amounting to a good life. As a side note, the owner just came up to me to pick up the empty dishes from my table. I advised him that I was writing a passage about our encounter, at which point he unleashed a radiant smile and said, "Thank you, that's very flattering." Ideological impediments to happiness. I teach at a business school, so my teaching must have real-world applications. In all my courses, be they on evolutionary consumption, the psychology of decision-making, or consumer behavior, I always begin by laying the foundations of how evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology are necessary to fully understand the human mind. When I first ask my students to explain how this knowledge might be relevant to marketers, they are oftentimes unsure what to answer. I quickly remind them that a great marketer or an effective advertiser is one who has a deep understanding of human nature. If you create advertising messages or design products that are congruent with our evolved expectations, you increase your odds of success. If you choose to target consumers whilst ignoring the biologically based preferences that shape our minds and bodies, you do so at your peril. Take, for example, romance novels. The readership for this genre is almost exclusively female. It is a form of fantasy escapism for women centered around a desirable male who fits an ideal archetype. He is tall, socially dominant or successful, a prince or a neurosurgeon. He has an impressive abdomen, including six-pack abs, and he's a little dangerous and reckless and can only be tamed by the love of the female protagonist. From a marketing perspective, this is not difficult to understand. Women do not fantasize about pear-shaped men with high-pitched nasal voices who suck their thumbs in a fetal position whilst having a good cry watching Bridget Jones's Diary when taking a break from playing video games all day in mom's basement. That is not part of the repertoire of female fantasies. But for a moment, let us suppose that an ultra-progressive publisher of romance novels decided to break free from the shackles of toxic masculinity and boldly created a new line of books with a wimpy and sensitive male archetype called the Brian Stelter line. This would impart unhappiness on all, both the female readers, since none of them likely fantasizes about Stelter types, and ultimately the company's executives. And their bottom line, commercial happiness, success, would only be restored when the company released the GADSAD line. What about socio-economic and political systems? How are these related to human flourishing? To answer this question, I return to one of my favorite quotes offered by the late Harvard entomologist E.O. Wilson. When asked about the failings of Marxism, he replied, "Good ideology, wrong species." As an expert on the social organization of ants, he knew that what might work in the largely egalitarian ant society, one reproductive queen, a few drones, and many workers, would not work in human societies. Humans are not as interchangeable as most ants are. We are far more differentiated in our talents, our personalities, our drives, and our abilities. And this natural heterogeneity leads to natural hierarchies. Humans thrive in every way, economically and in their pursuit of happiness, when given the freedom to instantiate their individuality. This is precisely why East Germany had walls meant to stop its citizens from fleeing to the West. Too many East Germans knew that if they could escape from the utopian egalitarianism of communism, they would flourish and be happy in the capitalist West. It is the same reason that for more than 6 decades, Cubans have risked shark-infested waters to seek freedom and happiness on the shores of the United States. Political and economic systems that are antithetical to human nature inevitably produce unhappiness. On the other side of the ledger, the economic freedom, competition, and prosperity produced by capitalism is a leading cause of Western happiness, including in the so-called social welfare states of Scandinavia, which are still capitalist societies. The real-world experiments of comparing socialist communist countries and capitalist ones have been repeated on countless occasions, and the data could not be any clearer that socialist communist societies produce poverty and misery, and capitalist societies produce prosperity and happiness. And yet, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders persist in their ideological delusions, unencumbered by the corrective historical evidence to the contrary. Militant feminism, which, like socialism and communism, is something that I would call an idea pathogen, a bad idea that gets transmitted virally, largely by universities, is an ideology that has imparted immeasurable misery on millions of women because it denies human nature and the reality of sexual differences, that men and women should be treated equally under the law. Equity feminism is a veridical position, but militant feminism has pursued the idea of sexual equality to the point of lunacy, arguing that any differences in behaviors between the sexes are manifestations of an evil patriarchy that must be eradicated. Take, for example, the old alleged double standard regarding human sexuality, namely that promiscuous men are admired, whereas promiscuous women are reviled. According to feminist ideology, this is a means by which the patriarchy keeps women in check. Say no to the patriarchy, burn your bras, engage in meaningless one-night stands, and refrain from having children. Hey ladies, you are no different from men, and if they are promiscuous, you should be too. Millions of women answered that call. And yet the longitudinal data tracking women's happiness levels have shown that the trends are going in the wrong direction. Specifically, over a 35-year period, women's levels of subjective well-being in the United States have declined, both in an absolute sense as well as relative to men. This is perhaps not too difficult to explain. Convincing women about the virtues of one-night stands is certain to make men happier than women, at least in the short term. Unencumbered sex is seldom a path to happiness for women. It is marriage, which relies on commitment and trust, not promiscuity, that is positively correlated with happiness. This does not imply that women do not, at times, enjoy the pursuit of unencumbered sexual variety, but they certainly do not do so to the same extent as men. To recognize this obvious evolutionary fact does not make one a patriarchal misogynist, but someone rooted in reality. It is incontestable that many postulates of militant feminism have been detrimental to women's senses of happiness. Larry Elder is a highly successful nationally syndicated radio host who espouses wise and commonsensical positions on politics and economics. And because these positions are designated dangerously conservative by the media elite, Elder, a black man, has even been referred to as the black face of white supremacy by apocalyptic progressives. Progressives are fully committed to diversity, inclusion, and equity. The de-religion, as I coined it in The Parasitic Mind, and the advancement of people of color. As long as such folks do not commit the unforgivable act of exhibiting personal agency and freedom of thought when people of color violate edicts of progressive orthodoxy, they become white supremacists, obviously. Elder has long weighed in on the ills of the black community. Rather than blaming systemic racism, he argues that black people, like anyone else, can be successful in a free society like the United States. The reason for high rates of black poverty and crime is not systemic racism, but the absence of fathers in the lives of so many black families. The research showing that this is true is vast and has been known for decades, even if progressives prefer to ignore it, or deny it, or blame systemic racism. Elder, however, rightly recognizes that if we want to maximize people's opportunities to live a good life, then we need to be honest and properly identify the real impediments rather than indulge in politically correct, blame others, faux causality. Is one's political orientation related to happiness and well-being? Numerous studies have established that conservatives report being happier than liberals, exhibit greater well-being, and possess a greater sense of meaning and purpose in life. Anecdotally, my public engagement in the culture wars seems to support this general premise, especially when you compare conservatives to these super-woke progressives, or as I call them, the blue-haired Taliban, who are always angry, cantankerous, and miserable, and dedicated to radically altering society to create utopia or, in fact, dystopia. Conservatives, on the other hand, tend to be happy and content, because they are grounded in the eternal truths of humanity and human nature, have a much stronger sense of family and nurturing traditions, and have an appreciation for the order and ancient wisdom that has brought us Western democracy and capitalism. Progressives seek to eradicate the past, knocking down statues, rewriting textbooks, banning old books of which they disapprove, and start anew. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, whom I refer to as Occasional Cortex, apparently, so does Michael Savage, even wishes to dismantle existing buildings and refit them in a way that is consistent with the so-called Green New Deal. Those who have a burning desire to destroy the past and the present are unlikely to be happy, and their promise or belief that utopia is just around the corner is false and can never be fulfilled, which leads to further unhappiness. Happiness without God. If conservatives are happier than liberals, and conservatives are more religious than liberals, does that mean that religion makes people happier? For many people, life cannot have full purpose and meaning without a religious or spiritual component. I have long argued, though, that there are endless ways by which we can achieve a spiritual connection with nature, with others, and within ourselves, without requiring that such connections be rooted in a supernatural ethos. While conducting research for this book, I had to engage the thoughts of innumerable brilliant thinkers spanning several millennia. In doing so, I am intellectually connected to their ideas in a deeply meaningful and, one could say, spiritual manner. When I sit on a beach watching the sunset, I experience a deep reverence for the awe-inspiring beauty of nature without needing to root such a satisfying experience within a divine framework. That said, I fully understand that for most people, life is simply unsatisfying without a reverence for the divinely sacred, for God. Hence, even though I am a non-believer when it comes to the religious elements of my religion of birth, I am fully anchored in my Jewish identity and understand that religious belief is the rule when it comes to humanity, and I am part of a minority of unbelievers. Several years ago, I was asked to explain my ability to live a purposeful and meaningful life void of a guiding God. Here is what I wrote. It is an affront to human dignity to suggest that purpose and meaning in one's life can only be garnered via the belief in a deity. To lead a rich and righteous life is more laudable when pursued void of the guiding edicts of a dictatorial higher power. My life is fulfilling in endless earthly ways, be it via my intellectual and scientific pursuits, my university teaching, the love that I share with my family members, beloved canine companions and close friends, traveling to new lands to immerse myself in new cultures and awe-inspiring landscapes, nourishing my being with knowledge, music, art, and films, and innumerable other daily quests, each of which reminds me of the magic of life. Carpe diem, seize the day, is best instantiated when one recognizes the ephemeral and finite nature of our existence. There are no supernatural do-overs or eternal afterlives. My lack of religiosity makes it easier for me to appreciate the importance of every second, every minute, and every hour. You get one shot to experience life fully and hopefully make a difference. To assuage the existential angst inherent to our ever-looming mortality, I say, fear not. Immortality can be achieved, but not via a religious-based afterlife. As a loving father to my children, I am effectively propagating my genes, while as an author and professor, I am disseminating my memes onto future generations. To recognize the evolutionary roots of our lifelong pursuits does not render them any less awe-inspiring. Instead, science and reason liberate us from the shackles of superstition by offering us a framework for understanding our shared humanity. Ultimately, we all have the capacity to treasure life and enrich the world in incalculable ways, each of which does not require adherence to religious dogma. As an evolutionist, I am well aware of the tension between science and religion generally, and evolution and religion in particular. That said, the late paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould argued that religion and science ought to peacefully coexist via the NOMA principle, non-overlapping magisteria. Namely, they each tackle separate, non-overlapping questions, such as science explaining the natural world, while religion works on establishing moral truths. I personally reject this dichotomy as false because I believe that morality does not reside outside the reach of science, and can be explained by our evolution as a social species. In any case, in several of my previous books, I have discussed the evolutionary roots of religion as well as the functional benefits reaped from religion. While I may not be a religious person, I fully appreciate that the default value is for humans to be believers. If so, does being religious make people happier? Religiosity and happiness generally exhibit a small positive correlation, though the findings have been quite mixed, with some studies yielding no correlation between the two constructs. In other instances, the strength of the correlation has been shown to vary as a function of cultural settings, of interest, spirituality, but not the extent of religious practice, has been shown to be a strong predictor of happiness in children. There is no single path for achieving happiness. Some cannot imagine being happy without God, while others reject the need for the supernatural and find that rejection no impediment to experiencing the good life. Happiness has many causal elements, including our genes and personalities, the culture in which we grow up, the political and economic system in which we live, the mindsets we adopt, and the decisions that we make. In the next chapter, I turn to two of the most important decisions when it comes to happiness.